In 1985, the Cold War was entering its final throes. The policies of openness and reform by newly installed Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev marked the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. 1985 was also the year of the spy. This was owing to the dozen or so high-profile espionage cases that dominated American news headlines. One of the spies arrested that year stands out from among his peers. His story is remarkable not only for the quantity of secret material he delivered over his short spying career, but also for whom he delivered it to. Jonathan Jay Pollard was a civilian intelligence analyst at the US Navy's Anti-Terrorist Alert Center in Maryland. He delivered the equivalent of 30 filing cabinets worth of top-secret and classified material to Israel over an 18-month period. The revelation that a Jewish American had been run as a spy by Israeli intelligence on American soil sparked a major controversy and caused two allies to teeter on the edge of a diplomatic crisis. Pollard's arrest marked the beginning of a saga that would captivate and polarize opinions for decades. His imprisonment made him a symbol of one of the most contentious episodes in the history of American intelligence. Born on the 7th of August 1954, Jonathan Pollard was the youngest of three siblings. His father, Dr. Morris Pollard, was an accomplished microbiologist. Just prior to Jonathan's 8th birthday, his father accepted a position at Notre Dame University, and the Pollard family moved to South Bend in Indiana. Jonathan was an intelligent child who always had his nose in a book. He was teased, bullied, and beaten up at school, which he attributed to anti-Semitism. These circumstances led his parents to enroll him at a private Hebrew day school. The Pollard family was proudly Jewish, and Jonathan and his siblings grew up within a strong Jewish tradition and culture. At his new school, Jonathan started to develop a zeal for Judaism and established the foundation of his later Zionist beliefs. He observed Israel's existential crisis and ultimate victory in the 1967 Six-Day War, and shortly after his bar mitzvah, Jonathan visited the memorial site at the Dachau concentration camp, the notorious World War II Nazi death camp. These were experiences that left lasting imprints on him and heightened his sense of devotion to the Jewish people and the Israeli state. There is no doubt that young Jonathan Pollard was a gifted student. His abilities led him in 1970 to be awarded a chance to attend a science camp at the prestigious Weizmann Institute. His love for Israel grew exponentially during this period of his life, with Jonathan's mother having to convince him not to make Aliyah, that is, to return to the Jewish Holy Land. However, notwithstanding his ethnic and religious devotion, he had a penchant for mischief, getting involved in a fight while at the camp and being remembered by one of the scientists there as an unstable troublemaker. After graduating high school with honors, Jonathan enrolled at Stanford University. Here he developed a fantasy for espionage and a desire to become a secret agent. He bragged to his classmates about being a spy working for Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency. This was, of course, an outright lie, and just one of many examples of Pollard's compulsion to lie and spin tales of grandiose delusion. He took the story so far as to refer to himself as Colonel Pollard in his college yearbook. He graduated from Stanford with a political science degree and was then accepted into the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Boston. There he attended for 2 years, flunking out after failing to complete several courses. Pollard had, however, by that stage, already decided that he wanted to pursue a career in intelligence. Pollard applied for a graduate fellowship position with the CIA, and as part of the interview process was required to take a polygraph examination. During the test, he admitted to using Thai sticks and hashish, and to smoking marijuana about 600 times during his university career. Understandably, he was turned down for the position. Undeterred, in 1979, Pollard applied to become an intelligence analyst for the U.S. Navy Field Operational Intelligence Office located in Suitland, Maryland. The position required top secret and sensitive compartmented information security clearances. While Pollard had to undergo an extensive background information check, a polygraph test was this time not required. The check included a general request to other intelligence agencies for any information they had on record. The CIA, however, citing privacy concerns, declined to release the information they held on Pollard, including the results of his polygraph test. Had it done so, this story may have ended here. Pollard passed the background check and was given the job and assigned to the Naval Ocean Surveillance Information Center, where he monitored shipping traffic. Only a month or two into his job, Pollard approached one of his superiors with a proposal. He said that he had a contact in the South African government and that he could use this connection to run an operation against the then apartheid government. Pollard boasted to his superior that his father worked for the CIA and was the station chief at the American Embassy in South Africa. This was, of course, another brazen lie. The technical director to whom Pollard had made the proposal knew this to be false and recommended to the head of the agency that Pollard be terminated immediately since he was still serving his probationary period. Remarkably, the opposite occurred, with Pollard being assigned to a secret task force called Task Force 168, which collected human intelligence for the Navy. Pollard was distrusted by his superiors in TF 168, who began to second-guess the appointment. It was decided that a ruse would be pulled in order to compel Pollard to sit through a polygraph exam. He was told that he was being recruited as an agent to pursue his South African connection, but that he would have to pass a polygraph test first. When the test was administered, Pollard displayed bizarre behavior, shouting, gagging, and repeatedly running to the bathroom in between questions. Pollard was a nervous wreck, and after hours of attempting to question him in vain, the examiner had to abandon the test. While the test itself was inconclusive, the examiner stated categorically that Pollard should never be used as a double agent, nor should he be granted access to any sensitive or top-secret information. As a result, then Director of Naval Intelligence Rear Admiral Sumner Shapiro directed that Pollard be moved to a new position in the organization and one in which he would not require TS or SCI security clearance. Although still holding a secret security clearance, Pollard was incensed. He considered his higher clearance a status symbol, and one which he wore as a badge of honor. He reverted to playing the professional victim, blaming the Navy for being anti-Semitic and sidelining him for this reason. He lodged a grievance with his employer and effectively went to war with the Navy. Eventually, and after threatening legal action, Pollard had his security clearance restored on the 19th of January 1982. This reinstatement, made reluctantly, was subject to quarterly monitoring and reporting by his line manager. These reports said that Pollard's performance was exemplary and that he was making a valued contribution to the NICS's mission. Eventually, however, and after personnel changes, the reporting and monitoring stopped. In 1981, Pollard met Ann Henderson, an attractive and intelligent 21-year-old woman from New York who worked in the press room of the National Rifle Association. The two soon fell in love and in 1982 moved in together in an apartment in Arlington, Virginia. Then followed a series of further red flags which were either missed or ignored by the Navy. These included Pollard getting into financial trouble and nearly being evicted from his apartment for failing to pay rent. After moving to the DuPont Circle area of Washington, D.C. in 1982, Pollard and Ann regularly smoked marijuana and took cocaine at various parties. On another occasion, Pollard had applied for a new position that opened up within the Navy. He arrived to the interview late and disheveled. He spun a story about his girlfriend Ann having been kidnapped by members of the Irish Republican Army, and that he had spent the weekend running around the Washington area negotiating for her release. Needless to say, Pollard didn't get the job, but the incident was never reported up the chain of command. Whether these incidents were not appropriately reported or were simply chalked up to personal eccentricities, Pollard continued to climb the bureaucratic ladder and was noted as being an intelligent and hard-working analyst. Yet Jay Pollard was discontented. He grew increasingly concerned over the security position of his ethnic home, Israel. As a nation, Israel has since its creation in 1948 faced the unenviable position of being surrounded by enemies. Despite a series of US presidents describing the relationship between Israel and the USA as a special friendship, Pollard believed that his country of birth was not doing enough to protect its ally. Friendly relations between Israel and the USA suffered a setback in June of 1981 when the Israeli Air Force executed a coordinated attack against Osirak in Iraq, a nuclear reactor facility. The operation was a major success, with Saddam Hussein's nuclear capabilities completely neutralized. However, the US and other nations considered the move a violation of international law. For a period after this event, US intelligence began to withhold certain information from its Israeli ally for fear that it would act on it in a similar fashion. It would take 2 years for the countries to formally restore their strategic channels of communication, with US President Ronald Reagan signing an agreement with Israel concerning bilateral information exchange in 1983. Pollard, however, believed that the US was not keeping up its end of the bargain and was withholding information relating to key aspects of Israeli national security. He considered his options and was torn between, on the one hand, immigrating to Israel and taking with him what information he could carry, or, on the other, remaining as an analyst in the US and using his security clearance to provide classified material to Israel. Needless to say, he opted for the latter option, which had the added benefit of allowing him to live out his fantasy of being a secret agent. Circumstances would soon allow Jonathan Pollard to pursue his goal. On the 18th of April 1983, a lone suicide bomber drove a truck filled with explosives into the US Embassy in Beirut, killing 63 people. Then, 6 months later, on the 23rd of October 1983, a Hezbollah terrorist drove a truck packed with TNT into the US Marine Amphibious Unit compound at Beirut International Airport. The detonation killed 220 Marines, 21 other service members, and injured another 100 people. In response to these attacks, the Naval Investigative Service established a new intelligence unit called the Anti-Terrorist Alert Center, or ATAC. Pollard was initially transferred for a 6-month period to ATAC, and then on the 14th of October 1984 was hired as a permanent employee. The ATAC was designed to have computer links to all the US military intelligence collection commands. Pollard found himself, therefore, with virtually unlimited access to all highly classified information stored within the CIA, NSA, and FBI databases, among others. He was also given a courier card, which allowed him to carry classified materials on his person anywhere in the Washington, D.C. area without fear of being searched. For an aspiring double agent, Pollard could have chosen no better place. It was around this time that Pollard was contacted by a friend of his, Stephen Stern. Stephen was a wealthy New York stockbroker. The two men would discuss business opportunities and the current state of affairs in Israel. During one such discussion, Stephen mentioned to Jonathan that he had attended a conference where he listened to a speaker by the name of Colonel Aviem Sela. The colonel was studying for his PhD in New York at the time, and Stern wanted to make an introduction. Pollard knew exactly who Colonel Sela was, an Israeli war hero and a national icon. He was in fact the fighter pilot that led the 1981 attack on Osirak and had also gained fame for shooting down as many as 90 Syrian MiG fighter planes in the 1982 war in Lebanon. Pollard knew immediately that this was his golden opportunity to offer his services to Israel. He gratefully accepted the invitation and immediately rushed to tell his girlfriend Anne about the good turn of events. Pollard had only just started working at his new position at ATAC when one evening he received a telephone call from Colonel Sela. The two men arranged to meet at the Washington Hilton Hotel in May of 1984. Despite all his military accomplishments, Aviem Sela was no spy runner. He had no experience in human intelligence or espionage, but knew that he was dealing with a potentially delicate matter. Through a civilian contact stationed at Israel's New York consulate, Sela got in touch with Lakam, an Israeli agency tasked with gathering scientific intelligence. This was an agency much smaller in scale and reach than Israel's more well-known intelligence centers, Mossad and the Shabak. It was, however, headed by one of Israel's preeminent spy masters, Raphael Rafi Eitan, famous for his role in capturing notorious Nazi leader Adolf Eichmann. Eitan gave his blessing to Seller for the meeting to go ahead, but advised that he proceed with caution. Walk-ins always had to be treated with circumspection. Who knew? Pollard may have been a plant by one of its rival intelligence agencies. Yet even if he wasn't, the fallout, should Israel be discovered to even be considering spying against its closest ally, would be catastrophic. The first meeting between Jonathan Pollard and Aviem Seller went ahead on the 24th of May 1984. The two men immediately found common ground in their shared love for Israel and a growing concern for its welfare. Pollard wasted no time in telling Seller the kind of information he had access to at work, which to Seller sounded almost too good to be true. As a test, Seller requested to see a small sample of the type of intelligence Pollard had access to. To arrange their next meeting, Seller told Pollard that he would call him at home and mention a Hebrew letter. This directed Pollard to one of the several payphones located near to his home, which had been assigned that specific letter. A week later, Pollard and Seller met again at the Hilton Hotel, but then traveled together to a park adjoining the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library in Georgetown. Pollard had brought with him a briefcase stuffed with classified material, including a 3-volume series on Saudi Arabian ground forces and a ground logistics study. But what clinched the deal was when Pollard pulled out satellite photos of the Osirak site following the Israeli operation. Seller was amazed. He had never seen the fruit of his labors for which he had gained so much fame. Any doubts that he had about Pollard immediately evaporated. A third meeting was soon arranged for the 21st of July 1984 at the Holiday Inn in Chevy Chase, Maryland. This time, Pollard brought with him 2 large suitcases packed to bursting with classified and top-secret documents. Seller and Pollard traveled together in a rental car to a house on Deborah Street in Potomac, Maryland. This was a house owned by Ilan Ravid, the attaché for scientific affairs at the Israeli embassy in Washington. The documents Pollard had brought with him, marked TS or SCI, and which Pollard had to return to his office by the next Monday morning, were photographed and handed back to him. At this meeting, Pollard was told that he would be required to travel to Paris that November to meet the man in charge of the whole operation. The compensation to be paid to Pollard for his efforts was also discussed, it being loosely agreed that he would be paid the equivalent of his annual salary working for the NIS, which was $1,000 per month. By this stage, Pollard and Anne had got engaged. This was used as the cover story for his trip to Paris. Anne was to accompany Jonathan, with the couple posing as lovebirds on vacation to purchase an engagement ring and celebrate their upcoming nuptials. Pollard could never have afforded the trip and the engagement ring on his federal salary, and so he invented a fictitious wealthy uncle whom he named Joe Fisher. Uncle Joe was not able to attend the wedding, and so generously paid for the couple's holiday, along with an expensive sapphire and diamond engagement ring. Pollard was told not to tell Anne the true reason for their trip, but that horse had already bolted. Although he assured Seller that Anne knew nothing, Pollard was telling Anne every last detail about his new career as a double agent. The couple journeyed to Paris in November 1984. They stayed at the expensive Paris Hilton International Hotel and dined at expensive restaurants, all on the account of the Israelis. Pollard was also introduced to Yosef Yossi Yager, who he later learned was the scientific attaché to the Israeli consulate in New York City. For 3 days, while the men discussed operational planning and tasking, Anne was taken on shopping trips, which included the purchase of the engagement ring. Once business had been attended to, Lacam sponsored a 3-week tour of Europe for Pollard and his fiancée. Returning to the US flush with cash and very much in love, Jonathan and Anne blew their newfound money on food, drink, and drugs. For the next 18 months, Pollard's spying went into overdrive. He provided the Israelis with reams of classified material pilfered from his office in Suitland. Every Friday, Pollard would cram his briefcase full of classified materials, which he would take to his 1980 Ford Mustang, sometimes doing this multiple times in the day. He then transferred the documents to suitcases, often while parked at a nearby car wash. Pollard then rendezvoused with Seller and other Lakam agents twice a week. The meetings were moved to an apartment nearer the Israeli embassy, which was home to Embassy Secretary Irit Erb. Pollard would also meet Yago on the last Saturday of each month at Erb's apartment to be given a shopping list of further documents that they required and to discuss the value of the previous delivery. The primary information Israel was after concerned the military and nuclear capabilities of Pakistan and Israel's Arab neighbors. The Israelis also chiefly wanted to learn about the assistance those countries were receiving from the Soviet Union. Pollard and his handlers proceeded with reckless abandon. They didn't follow any form of standard spycraft, such as dry cleaning en route to their meetings or arranging dead drops to exchange information. They assumed nobody would ever suspect that the Israelis had recruited an American spy, and they were exactly right. On one occasion, in January 1985, Pollard returned to his office after hours to remove multiple boxes filled with secret documents. Given his courier card, he was not questioned by the on-duty security guard, who even placed a block to stop the door from closing behind Pollard as he went to and from his car. Several Xerox machines were installed at the Israeli apartment to copy the most sensitive documents which Pollard had to return to his office. As the operation ramped up, Rafi Eitan decided it was time to replace Colonel Seller with a seasoned spy runner. Enter Uzi. The man whose true name was Yaakov Nimrodi was an international arms dealer and well-versed in the art of espionage. He was charged with being Jonathan Pollard's new handler. In the summer of 1985, Jonathan and Anne made a second overseas trip, this time to Israel. Pollard was growing ever more anxious as he met with his handlers in Tel Aviv. It was the year of the spy, after all. American spies and double agents were being rounded up left, right, and center. The members of the Walker spy ring had just been arrested in May of 1985. Pollard worried that he would be next. He was devastated to learn that Rafi Eitan intended to continue the operation for another 10 years. In convincing a nervous Pollard to sign up to this deal, his compensation was increased to $2,500 per month. He was also promised an Israeli passport and was told that to secure his eventual retirement in Israel, $30,000 would be deposited annually into a Swiss bank account for the next 10 years. He also didn't have to worry about his upcoming wedding in Venice and European honeymoon. That too would be paid for. Finally, Pollard was given assurances that he would be taken care of if he was ever discovered. After all, Israel and the USA were close allies, and a small matter of spying between friends was nothing a little bit of quiet diplomacy couldn't sort out. Somewhat assuaged, and with dollar signs in their eyes, Jonathan and Anne set off for Venice, where they were married on the 9th of August 1985. They then enjoyed a lavish honeymoon across Europe and London, returning to the United States as husband and wife a few weeks later. Jonathan Pollard immediately picked up where he left off, stealing every secret document he could lay his hands on. While sense would dictate that Pollard would have tried to keep a low profile, he couldn't resist telling tall tales to his colleagues. On one occasion, he spun another story about Anne being kidnapped, this time from a gun show, and that she was being held hostage in a nearby motel. To another colleague, Pollard claimed to have been taken prisoner in Damascus and tortured by the Syrians. He boasted about having a degree in advanced mathematics and continued to spin the false story of his father working for the CIA. His work performance began to drop, and this combined with his persistent fibbing resulted in Pollard being given a verbal warning. He was also quick to flaunt his security clearance to impress anybody who cared to listen. On several occasions, Pollard handed classified documents to people in his social circle. This included copies of economic and political analyses, which he gave to 2 investment advisor friends. He also wanted to get into the arms trade, just like Uzi. He tried to pass secret materials to Kurt Lobeck, a freelance journalist covering the Soviet-Afghan War, whom he tried to enlist in an arms trafficking scheme. Given his careless approach and constant braggadocio, Pollard's luck in remaining undetected was bound to only last for so long. On Friday, the 8th of November 1985, a co-worker spotted Pollard removing documents marked TS-SCI from the office. This in itself ought not to have raised suspicions given Pollard's courier card, but the co-worker overheard Pollard earlier in the day saying that he intended to destroy the documents which he had requested in error. Only a few minutes later, the co-worker spotted Pollard handing the same bundle of documents to his wife Anne outside the building in the parking lot. This incident was reported up the chain of command, eventually making its way onto the desks of NIS and FBI investigators. Pollard's concerns had been realized. Vigilance and security awareness within military and naval intelligence was heightened in the wake of the Walker-Whitworth espionage case. Pollard was also observed to be showing unusual interest in matters in the Middle East, whereas his role related to intelligence gathering and analysis in the Americas and the Caribbean. He was acting erratically and his work standards were continuously dropping. He generally gave the impression of being a disgruntled employee. The FBI were concerned enough to start an investigation. They authorized the installation of pinhole cameras around Pollard's office cubicle. He was watched round the clock and was followed when leaving the office parking lot. The NIS's own internal investigator, Ronald Olive, was also put on the case. The surveillance would have paid off had somebody been monitoring the video feed on the morning of the 15th of November 1985. The cameras were not watched for a crucial 3-minute period when Pollard stuffed as many as 3,000 pages of classified material into his briefcase. Nevertheless, investigators knew that Pollard would likely attempt to leave the office the following Monday with another bundle of classified documents. This is when they intended to close in. On Monday, the 18th of November 1985, plans were afoot to intercept Jonathan Pollard at the end of the workday. He was seen on the hidden cameras packaging a bundle of classified documents. As he approached his car carrying the package, he was intercepted by 2 FBI agents. There wasn't enough evidence to arrest Pollard at that stage, and so investigators needed him to speak to them voluntarily. He was asked to return inside to answer some questions. Appearing confused, Pollard thought better of refusing and agreed to return inside. Then followed an interview that would last long into the night. Pollard had an answer for everything and admitted nothing. His story was that he was in fact wanting a second opinion on the classified documents from an analyst friend working for another US intelligence agency. The FBI agents were trying to get Pollard to agree to a permissive search of his apartment. They had no warrant and were at that stage entirely dependent on Pollard's cooperation. As minutes turned to hours, the investigators realized that they couldn't hold Pollard for much longer. He wasn't under arrest and was free to leave at any time. He also wasn't budging from his position of denial and avoidance. He was due that night to meet Colonel Seller along with his wife for dinner. Pollard requested to phone Anne to let her know that he was running late. This he did, telling Anne over the phone to go on without him and that she should take the cactus, you know, the one that they had bought for their friend's birthday, and not to forget the wedding album. This was Pollard giving his wife Anne a pre-agreed code to let her know that he was in trouble. This was her signal to remove or destroy any classified documents that were being stored at their apartment. On the other end of the line, Anne quickly hung up and got to work. She filled a suitcase with all the documents she could find lying around the flat, and convinced a neighbor to hold onto the suitcase for the time being. She contacted Seller and told him that Jay was in trouble. Colonel Seller had no intention of hanging around and jumped on the first plane back to Israel. Jonathan and Anne would have done well to do the same. Back at ATAC offices, investigators took a break from the interview. As Pollard was returning from the restroom, he bumped into NIS Special Agent Olive. Using his best good cop routine, Olive suggested to Pollard that he agree to a cursory search of his apartment. After all, he had nothing to hide, right? Better to dispel the cloud of suspicion that was hanging over his head than risk a lengthy investigation. Reluctantly, Jonathan Pollard agreed. Agent Olive and the 2 FBI agents went immediately to Jay Pollard's apartment. He was counting on Anne to have stashed away any incriminating evidence. She arrived a few minutes later, breathless and agitated after stashing the heavy suitcase of documents with the neighbor. Jonathan and Anne sat on a couch while investigators tore through their apartment. Both must have been mortified when a pile of 60-odd classified documents were brought out from their bedroom, which were found in a box under a pile of dirty laundry in the closet. Jay Pollard, of course, had an answer for everything. He was a hard-working analyst. He worked long hours and sometimes brought home classified documents to work on after hours. Pollard agreed, despite his prior experiences, to take a polygraph test. In a bizarre turn of events, the FBI withdrew from the matter at that point, telling NIS to deal with it internally. After Agent Olive and the others left the Pollard apartment that night, Jay and Anne raced to a nearby 24-hour coffee shop to regroup and plan their next move. They tried to call Aviem Seller, but received an answer from Joseph Jago. He told Jonathan to stall the investigators for 72 hours and hung up. Pollard assumed that this was how much time was needed to implement a rescue plan. But oh, how wrong he was. The next day, Tuesday, the 19th of November, Jonathan Pollard tried to avoid the polygraph test by calling in sick. After being convinced to still take the test, Pollard arrived at the office wanting to first speak to Agent Olive. While somewhat unconventional, it was decided that Agent Olive would interview Pollard. His story was at first that the documents he had taken related to possible arms smuggling to Afghanistan through South Africa. The documents, Pollard said, he had supplied to freelance journalist Kurt Lobeck. Agent Olive wasn't buying this story, but he allowed Pollard to ramble on. He initially denied receiving any compensation, but eventually admitted to receiving $2,500 a month for his efforts. Agent Olive then broke the meeting to inform the FBI that they were dealing with a full-blown case of espionage. When the meeting resumed, now with an FBI agent in tow, Jay Pollard signed an 11-page confession detailing his crimes. The confession was, however, a mix of half-truths and outright lies, making no mention of the Israelis. The investigators needed more before making an arrest. The interview was adjourned for the night and Pollard was driven home. He and Anne were surveilled, but not closely enough, as it turned out. Pollard managed to evade his minders and got to a nearby payphone that night. After trying unsuccessfully to reach Jago, he contacted the Israeli embassy. He desperately wanted an update on the plan to extract him and Anne. Meanwhile, investigators were tipped off as to the suitcase full of classified documents, which was quickly retrieved and later searched. As fate would have it, Pollard's interview would never resume. Anne was suffering from a medical condition and was due to undergo a minor procedure in hospital the next day. Jay and Anne decided it was time to make a run for it. They had waited 72 hours, but the Israelis had not made contact. On the morning of Thursday, the 21st of November, Jonathan and Anne loaded their packed suitcases into the car and left their apartment building, managing again to evade FBI surveillance. Jonathan called the Israeli embassy from a payphone, and he was told that, provided he could shake off the FBI tail, they would be allowed refuge inside. After Anne's procedure at the hospital that morning, the FBI followed Jonathan's 1980 Mustang as it left the premises. They assumed that he would be returning to their apartment, but instead, Pollard led the investigators on a wild goose chase across the city, going this way then that, in an attempt to shake off the tail. Eventually, Pollard turned the car into a compound. When the agents realized that Pollard had entered the Israeli embassy, they were stunned. They didn't know at that stage which foreign power Pollard was supplying to, perhaps the Soviets, maybe one of the Arab countries, but the thought that a close ally was involved had never even entered their minds. Agents looked on helplessly as the embassy gates shut behind Pollard's vehicle. They saw Pollard exit the car and an exchange occurred between him and a guard. As a few minutes ticked by, the area outside the embassy began to swarm with police and FBI activity. But then, Pollard, appearing exasperated, got back into his car and turned it around. As he rolled out onto the street, he was immediately apprehended and taken into custody. Jonathan Jay Pollard had just then joined the ranks of spies having been left out in the cold. He was taken immediately to a nearby FBI field office. Anne hadn't yet been implicated in any wrongdoing and was thus free to go. Crying hysterically, she was driven back to her apartment. She was arrested the next day after the situation involving the suitcase was brought to light. The news of the arrests soon broke and the American public was stunned. Yet another double agent had been discovered in the so-called Year of the Spy. The scene was thus set for a period of tense relations between the US and Israel. For the first 3 days following Pollard's arrest, Israel remained strangely silent. Much to the US State Department's chagrin, the Israelis immediately withdrew Yossi Yago and Ilan Ravid from the Israeli embassy to avoid them being subjected to questioning. The American public were growing accustomed to learning about Soviet spies, but how could a small Middle Eastern state that was meant to be an ally have penetrated US intelligence? Hotly debated was the question of whether those with dual national loyalties should be permitted to work in US national security. Only on the 24th of November 1985 did Israel's foreign ministry release a statement. All that was said was that any act of espionage against the United States stood in total contradiction to Israeli policy. There was a promise of cooperation, with Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres promising to return any classified material that had been received from Pollard. Apart from this, Israel's leadership remained silent. All the while, US intelligence scrambled to establish how long Pollard had been a spy and the extent of the damage he may have caused. When Israel finally did break cover a few days later, its official position was that Pollard had been run as a rogue operation without the knowledge or consent of the highest echelons of Israeli political leadership. With tensions simmering, the US demanded more answers. The US Justice Department sent a delegation to Israel where those involved in the Pollard affair were interviewed in a secret location near a Tel Aviv military base. Those interviewed were promised immunity from prosecution in exchange for a full debriefing. The Israelis handed back only 163 documents they had received from Pollard, which was only a tiny fraction of the total number. Back in the United States, Jonathan Pollard was feeling bereft and abandoned. As the evidence against him was now overwhelming, and he had already partly admitted his espionage, he decided his best option was to fully cooperate with the authorities in the hopes of receiving leniency. After consulting with their attorneys, Jay and Anne Pollard decided to plea bargain. On the 4th of June 1986, Jonathan Pollard pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage. He confirmed that he was aware that the maximum sentence for such an offense was life in prison and a $250,000 penalty. Anne pleaded guilty to conspiracy to receive embezzled government property and accessory after the fact to possession of national defense documents. After their pleas were entered, a later date was arranged for a sentencing hearing. Jonathan was remanded to jail, whereas Anne was released on bond on medical grounds. The two plea agreements reached between prosecutors and the Pollards recorded the US government's agreement not to seek the maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Among these conditions were that Jonathan Pollard agreed to submit to a full debriefing and damage assessment, and, crucially, that he and Anne would not speak publicly about the matter without the prior permission of the Director of Naval Intelligence. During his extensive debriefing, Pollard was first to name Aviem Seller as being involved. Beyond his spying for Israel, Pollard also admitted to passing classified information, albeit on a comparatively smaller scale, to officials of other foreign governments, including apartheid South Africa. In the lead-up to the sentencing hearing, the defense and the prosecution exchanged various memoranda in aid of sentencing to Judge Aubrey Robinson. In a contentious move, Pollard submitted a 61-page memorandum in which he claimed to have spied to save Israel and to cause damage to the Soviet Union. He denied becoming a spy for financial gain, saying rather that he was motivated by the constant anti-Semitism he experienced in his daily life. On the 19th of January 1987, U.S. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger filed a lengthy classified memorandum which detailed the extent of the damage that Pollard had caused to U.S. national security. In what became known as the Weinberger Memorandum, the sheer volume of material Pollard made off with in 18 months was emphasized, enough to fill a room of 6 by 6 by 10 feet. Weinberger highlighted how dangerous it can be for classified information to be passed on, even to an ally, for who knows what other third parties may come into possession of it. There are those that believe Israel repackaged some of the intelligence they received from Pollard, passing it on to the Soviet Union in prisoner exchanges, and to allow for the continued immigration to Israel of Jews living in the Soviet Union. Then, just weeks before the sentencing hearing, Pollard agreed to be interviewed by Wolf Blitzer, a journalist at the time for the Jerusalem Post. On the 15th of February 1987, Blitzer's article titled "Pollard, Not a Bumbler but Israel's Master Spy" was published in the Washington Post. The article included details of classified materials Pollard had disclosed to Israel, including satellite photos of the Palestinian Liberation Organization headquarters in Tunisia and information concerning the military capabilities of various Arab nations. This was a clear breach of his plea deal, and prosecutors were incensed. They chose not, however, to file papers with the court advising of Pollard's reneging of the plea agreement. To make matters worse, Anne appeared on CBS's 60 Minutes on the 1st of March 1987, where she was interviewed by investigative reporter Mike Wallace. This was just 3 days prior to the sentencing hearing. The interview, intended by Anne and Jonathan to curry favor with the public and justify their actions, backfired spectacularly. Following the Blitzer interview, Defense Secretary Weinberger filed a supplementary memorandum in which he summed up his view of the harm caused by Pollard. He said, "It is difficult for me, even in the so-called Year of the Spy, to conceive of a greater harm to national security than that caused by the defendant in view of the breadth, the critical importance to the United States, and the high sensitivity of the information he sold to Israel." On the 4th of March 1987, Jonathan Pollard was sentenced to life imprisonment. Anne was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. Pollard's sentence immediately sparked controversy, with many considering the US government to have reneged on the plea deal by seeking a life sentence. Many were shocked by the severity of the sentence, given that many other US spies who had spied for the Soviet Union had got off far more lightly. In truth, what prosecutors had agreed with Pollard was to bring to the court's attention the nature, extent, and value of his cooperation in the investigation. Prosecutors still, however, recommended to the court that it impose a substantial period of incarceration and a monetary fine. It always remained within the judge's discretion to impose a sentence which could never be limited by any plea deal. In the media, opinions from Pollard's sympathizers and critics spanned the full gamut, portraying him in turn either as a selfless hero or a self-aggrandizing criminal. In Mark Shaw's Miscarriage of Justice, the author emphasized the disproportionality of Pollard's sentence, painting him as an intelligent but desperate and overly idealistic naval analyst. In The Hunting Horse, The Truth Behind the Jonathan Pollard Spy Case, Elliot Goldberg argued that Pollard was merely a scapegoat in a massive US effort to cover up its dealings with Saddam Hussein and his chemical weapons arsenal. In contrast, Agent Ronald Olive, the NIS investigator who played a key role in uncovering Pollard's espionage, wrote in his book, Capturing Jonathan Pollard, that he was greedy, arrogant, and unrepentant, the damage he caused being incalculable and colossal. Following sentencing, Pollard was moved around the U.S. prison system until being transferred to the Butner Federal Correction Complex in North Carolina. This is where he served the majority of his sentence. Anne Pollard served just 3.5 years of her 5-year sentence before being released on parole due to her ongoing health condition. After release, she immigrated to Israel. Despite campaigning for her husband's release, she received divorce papers from Jonathan out of the blue, seeking separation on the basis that the marriage had irretrievably broken down. Pollard soon remarried Esther Elaine Zeitz, a Canadian schoolteacher who had also campaigned for clemency. As Jonathan languished in jail year after year, support for him, both domestically in the United States and in Israel, began to mount. It was only in 1998 that Israel formally acknowledged Pollard as having been their spy. A formal proclamation said Jonathan Pollard had acted as an official Israeli agent handled by those serving as high-ranking senior officials of the Israeli Bureau for Scientific Relations. While still in jail, Pollard was granted Israeli citizenship. He failed in all appeals to have his sentencing overturned, and a succession of US presidents declined to grant clemency or to commute his sentence. Pollard even found himself being used as a bargaining chip in then US Secretary of State John Kerry's attempts to broker a Middle Eastern peace deal in 2014. But that too came to nothing. After spending 30 years behind bars, Jonathan Pollard was released on parole in 2015. His parole was subject to strict conditions, including that he live within the New York area, have limited to no access to the internet, report regularly to his parole officer, and wear an ankle bracelet. Once his parole conditions expired in 2020, Pollard realized his lifelong ambition to make Aliyah and immigrated to Israel with his wife Esther on the 30th of December 2020. Upon his arrival in Israel, he kissed the tarmac and was welcomed as a national hero by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Today, Pollard remains living in Israel. His second wife, Esther, sadly passed away of COVID in January 2022. Jonathan makes interview appearances on TV and gives keynote speeches telling of his life and experiences. He remains a celebrated hero in his new home, while his legacy of betrayal in the United States lives on, nearly 40 years later. The United States and Israel were able to put the Pollard saga behind them, although both sides likely remain more vigilant than before. During Pollard's many debriefings and polygraph exams, a common line of questioning was whether any others were involved in his espionage activities. Conspiracy theories circulated concerning a mysterious Mr. X, a shadowy top US government official rumored to be the kingpin in a much larger network of spies. Occam's razor would suggest, however, that this is an unlikely scenario. As with all spies and double agents, the factors and circumstances that led Jonathan Pollard to spy are varied. In his own mind, he was justified in what he did. In the mind of the law, he committed a criminal act and received a just punishment.